Hello, I'm Brian Resnick. I'm a senior investment strategist with AllianceBernstein, and welcome to Uncommon Capital, a podcast where we explore the far corners of the private markets and learn important lessons from professional investors. Today, I'm sitting down with Xiaoyu Gu, who's a managing director for AB CarVal, responsible for energy transition investments in North America. She joined AB CarVal in 2013 from Credit Suisse. Xiaoyu received her undergraduate degree from Harvard University and then went on to get her JD from Harvard Law School and her MBA from, you guessed it, Harvard Business School. Xiaoyu, thank you for joining me today.
Thanks, Brian. It's great to be here.
First question right out of the gates. Do you love Cambridge, or are you just a glutton for punishment?
I do enjoy Cambridge. It's a lot of fun. Love the young culture and just all the students, the vibe, the possibilities that's there. I also enjoy schooling, partly because I never really knew what I wanted to do, and it was easier to hide on campus. So.
And, you can get an A on a test and you know that you're doing well. It's easy to measure, right? I mean, it's not easy to get the A, but it's easy to measure. So why MBA in law school? I mean, were you interested in law? What was the thinking, behind doing those at the same time? That's, I imagine, a pretty tough load.
Yeah. I think it goes back to, the emphasis on education. I grew up with that sort of drilled into me. And it's, for at least my family, it was a path to, middle class and to opportunities. And the MBA, there's the thought, culturally, I guess, where it's a bit of a soft degree. And so the law, from that perspective, really provides concrete skills and learnings. And for me, I did work a bit before going back to grad school. And that experience really taught me the importance of understanding the regulatory landscape, of understanding contracts, of understanding, what the options are if things go wrong. And in all of that, law plays a really important role. And when I went back to law school and business school, it was actually during the financial crisis. So chose a good time to be hiding in school. And just the importance of, I think, regulation and policy and just the macro landscape and its impact on business and society, like that was a huge takeaway for me. And the access I got during school in that period sort of really opened up how I thought about the world.
So it served you well to have both of those.
Yes. And I do say, from a practical perspective, right, starting out in my first jobs after graduate school, it was very helpful to be able to say when someone presents me with, a huge stack of docs, I'm not intimidated. A couple hundred pages, here's the indenture, go through it, tell us, where people can try and do something bad to you. And even though I don't know much about the overall business context yet, because I was fresh out of school, didn't really have this experience prior, just having that law education gave me the confidence to say, yeah, sure, I don't mind reading a couple hundred pages and trying to figure out, which areas are important, which areas we should pay attention to. So that was extremely helpful. And then from a regulatory perspective, I think it's very helpful when you talk about, a new policy that comes out, and that happens a lot in my current coverage. I know intuitively, this is federal regulation. This is the way it kind of gets implemented, the difference between what the legislature does, what the agencies do, how the court system can potentially intervene if that's necessary versus, this is a state law, right? This is the framework you should be looking to. So it's just very helpful to have a general sense of where things are. And then I could ask the hard questions and the real lawyers, right, can give the answers.
That's great. Yeah. So what started out as a safety net turned it out to be very useful in your career. So I want to talk a little bit about your career. So, the first thing that I noticed is you started at Dean & Company, which is not a financial services firm per se. Tell me a little bit about that experience. What were you doing over there?
Yeah. As I mentioned, I never really had a path of, this is what I want to do with my life. Kind of wish I did. So my path is a bit circuitous, but there are learnings, I think, from every job. And with me and Dean & Company, it was a consulting job. It was in D.C., which for a recent grad was very attractive, sort of that vibe, a lot of young people doing all sorts of cool stuff. And for that, it was just exposure to a lot of basic business concepts. worked a bit on consulting in the sort of finance area, worked a bit for consulting for paper companies who weren't doing that well from a manufacturing perspective. What can go wrong? How do you deal with cuts? So just an introduction generally to business and things that can go right and go wrong in strategy. And for someone, I don't come from a family that has that background. And so just getting that real life experience was very valuable.
That's great. And yeah, DC is great for young people because everyone who lives there just moved there, right? So what a great place to meet other people. So let me ask you a question. So, how did you first get interested in energy transition? Was there kind of a moment that pulled you in?
I fell into it. I joined AB CarVal in 2013. And in 2014, OPEC, which is the big global syndicate who controls a lot of oil and gas supply, they decided they were no longer going to support prices. So it's a cartel, right? Historically, they kind of, depending on how much they produce, that determines global prices for oil and gas. And what happened was in the late 2000s, early 2010s, the shale revolution happened in the U.S., which basically meant people in the U.S., a lot of wildcatters, like small producers, were able to go and produce oil and gas at very cheap prices. And it became a free market versus a cartel where governments control that production. And so they flooded the market with volume. OPEC at first tried to control it by cutting back their own production. And at a certain point, they just said, you know what, we can't do that anymore. So we need to defend our market share. And who cares where prices go? It'll flush out all these little producers, right, who don't have the ability to stay in the game for very long when prices are that low. And so you saw oil prices go from, $140 plus per barrel down to 20-some dollars. And that is very painful. So I joined AB CarVal first in the distress strategy. And lo and behold, the entire oil and gas industry went into distress because of that. And that's how I got my start.
Yeah, it was an interesting time. I guess you'd call that the end of the commodity super cycle to some degree as well.
Yep.
And I remember living through that as well. When people talk about clean energy or transitional energy, they mean a lot of different things. And there's the public market aspect, but you focus on the private market aspect. And I'd love for you to just, for our listeners, to dimension your universe and how you think about sort of energy transition and what would be included in that.
Yeah, so the estimates vary. I think, anywhere from, 4 trillion to maybe 5 or 6 trillion a year goes into energy transition globally. Now, a lot of that does happen actually in the sovereign space, and some of it is in the public space. But what I work in, and a lot of what energy ends up being, which is infrastructure investing, that tends to be private. And so you'll see hundreds of billions that are quote unquote investable, even just in the US, a year just in that infrastructure space where you're supporting the build out of power plants, of basic energy infrastructure that then lasts decades. And for those, the public markets aren't quite as involved because it's not the corporate funding that you have, it's an actual project. And there you have a lot of banks involved, a lot of insurance companies when the assets are long dated, and infrastructure funds, and folks like us who invest in credit and private equity.
Yeah, and so, it sounds like these are pretty complicated projects with a lot of nuance. How do you begin to evaluate a project like that and determine if it's something attractive to you in terms of investing in?
The good thing about it is, these projects, at least in the energy space that we look at, there's a lot of them, right? We're not talking about building huge nuke plants. Those require a lot more dollars, and there aren't as many being built at any one time. The space that we invest in tends to be solar, wind, storage, where especially for solar and storage, some of those projects can be quite small and you just repeat and you do a lot of it. And it tends to be modular, which means having one of a certain size versus another one that's 10 times the size or 100 times the size. There are certain areas of underwrite for how to examine a project, what a project needs, that's actually replicable and very similar despite differences in project size or which markets they're in. So that's really helpful, right? A project is a project, and you could kind of look at the modeling, the inputs, the outputs, and say, does that make sense? Does that not make sense?
And so just, I guess, to double click a little bit on when you say storage, for those listeners that may be less familiar with the space, what do you mean by storage?
Yeah, so storage in this case is a reference to grid storage, which is the ability to store power for a certain amount of time. So, just some basics about our electricity grid. Supply and demand has to always equal on the grid. So, whatever people are consuming needs to be whatever's being produced at the time. And so, storage is a very helpful concept because it could temporarily take excess power and store it somewhere. And then when the grid needs more power, you have excess demand, they could then send that demand into the grid. Historically, that's been done through hydro, which is the dams. You think of that
Sure.
as storage, or even like molten salt, where you just, heat up a big pile of salt in a container somewhere, and then that's stored as thermal energy and then gets released when the grid needs it. But what I'm speaking to now is the revolution, I guess, in lithium-ion batteries. And think of it as your Tesla. When you're charging, discharging, it's the same thing, except you're doing it for the grid. So when the grid needs it, the battery sends the power onto the grid. And when power prices are really low and the grid has excess power, then the battery takes that power from the grid and stores it.
Essentially, you're making the grid more efficient by doing this.
Yeah.
I would ask you, does it really matter what the source of power is at that point? Or are you just taking from the grid when there's excess power, regardless of what the source is?
Yeah, so the source of power doesn't really matter because an electron is an electron on the grid. But an interesting thing about storage, at least our current storage technology, is it's actually a really good complementary to solar energy. So when you think about solar, the sun shines during the day and it's not there at night, right? And so there are certain times during the day, especially midday, when the sun is shining very bright and all those solar plants are producing so much energy that it's more than the grid can take. So there's excess demand. And that's a great time for storage to step in and take all that excess energy off the grid at very cheap prices, sometimes negative prices. So they're paid to take that excess energy, and then they store it. And then when you think, around 5, 6 p.m., 7 p.m., the sun sets, right, or goes lower, it's not producing as much energy. But this is when people go home, they're turning on the lights, they're cooking, they're turning on the TV. The demand's actually pretty high. So usually at these times, power prices tend to be higher because demand is more and the sun is not shining as much. So that's when storage can then send the excess power that it's stored back onto the grid at higher prices.
Wow, that's amazing. So it's almost like an arbitrage in the energy supply itself.
That's right.
The adoption of transitional energy and the technology has changed so much over the past decade alone. How has that changed the dynamic in terms of the attractiveness of the market? How do you think about, these projects in the context of new technologies and just more scaled adoption?
Yeah, there's definitely been a transformation, and it actually does tie very well into policy because it's not done sort of randomly, shall we say. But if you think about when the first solar panels were manufactured, right, it was for NASA's use in space to power the space station and their space experiments. But eventually that high-tech manufacturing technique got applied to stuff on the ground and to solar energy production. But at that stage, everything was still very much a science experiment. So it wasn't really scaled. It wasn't really, it's fun, it's cool, right? But you don't actually think of it being mass produced. And that started changing in the 80s and 90s. And the US was a huge front runner in terms of adapting that NASA technology and more military uses to actual commercial uses. And what ended up happening is, eventually China, through their policy, took over the baton from the US and Europe. And they started doing a lot more of it, spending a lot of money, central government mandate to grow. And all of that meant that the cost of the technology declined every year quickly as the technology scaled. And as people got better at producing these solar cells and modules and solar panels that you then build into solar plants. And so what we've seen over the last decade is wind costs have come down, 70% plus. Solar costs have come down 80% plus.
Wow.
And battery storage, even a decade ago, you could have said that was still a science experiment. But that's come down over 90% plus. And as a result, these technologies all of a sudden are scalable because they're cheap enough, and they're actually, in most places in the world, cheaper than conventional coal or natural gas.
And that's without policy support, just on their own.
On their own.
So that's a major shift. And I guess we can thank NASA for Velcro, styrofoam, and solar panels. So there's been a lot of policy change in the U.S., and I want to spend a little bit of time talking about policy without getting too deep into the weeds. But we had policy from the last administration that incentivized a lot of investment. Now we have the big, beautiful bill, which is sort of changing the investment landscape. In the U.S., how have you navigated that? And I imagine that must be one of the big challenges for you in this space.
Yeah, it's definitely been a journey, especially in the last year, in terms of just, I think at the end of the day, getting more certainty about the macro landscape. This industry is very resilient. And as we talked earlier, that cost decline is on a global basis. So any one country in particular, it's not going to impact the general transition that we're seeing happen. And it's happening very quickly. However, policy does play a large role, especially in this space, because we have historically had incentives, right? In the U.S., it's in the form of tax credits. So if you produce a project, you could have credits that you could use to offset your tax bill, and that's encouraged the build out of projects because it makes the cost of building projects lower. What we had in the prior administration was the passage of the Inflation Reduction Act, which basically provided a decades-long runway where the government said, we will have these tax credits in place for a really long time. Prior to that, these tax credits were renewed every couple years, sometimes during the year of, so there was less certainty, right, whether they were going to happen. They ended up happening, but it was very unclear, like how long they were going to last.
Right, there wasn't as much certainty. If you're thinking about a project that lasts longer than the policy, you have to factor that into your thinking.
And it takes years to build a project, right, at least a year or two. And so the Inflation Reduction Act provided the means and comfort for developers to say, all right, let's go, run at this, because we know we're going to get these tax credits for a long time, and we can plan out how we build our pipeline over multiple years. And the folks that are financing these investors can say, all right, we know there's certainty, so we can plan on funding these and making sure we have the money available, right, to support this build out. What the One Big Beautiful Bill did was it cut short the number of years that some of these tax credits would be available, especially for solar and wind. And it also put additional constraints on qualifying for these tax credits. So it became, or is today, less certain, or you have to jump more hoops, right, to ensure that you could actually get the benefit of these tax credits.
So how does that change your evaluation of a project in the U.S. today?
Yeah, I think it depends a lot on where that project sits, right? If it's a project that's already what we call safe harbored, which means you know that the old laws apply under the Inflation Reduction Act, they're going to get the tax credits. That's all certain. That's one thing. Versus a project that you say, maybe it makes it, maybe it doesn't make it. Versus a project that you know for sure will not get tax incentives. And all of those, in their differing ways, may be investable, but you have to know the difference on day one so that you could price it accordingly.
So the hurdles, it sounds like, are a little bit higher to make a project attractive. But as you said earlier, it sounds like a lot of these can stand on their own 2 feet without policy support at this point in the market cycle.
That's right. And it's all about the expectations, right? We need the certainty to say, okay, this is a project that falls in bucket one. Policy doesn't impact. We know it's going to get built. All right, let's price that one way. This is a bucket two. We don't know for sure. We think it is. All right, we need to build in some contingencies. And this is bucket three. We know we're not getting tax credits. We better price it low enough where we know that project is still economic despite not getting any incentives.
So we talked about the U.S. a little bit. Let's talk about outside the U.S. We have some other major economies like Europe, and you mentioned China earlier, that are obviously looking to be big players in this space for different reasons. Take me a little bit on a trip around the world and tell me what you think is going on there, what the opportunities look like today.
Yeah, so maybe I'll start with Asia. China has had a concerted effort to grow their renewables industry for a couple decades now. So it's part of their 5-year plan. And the central government dictates, okay, we want to grow this. It's strategic for us. And that means the banks provide low-cost financing. It means the local governments are doing all they can to support it. It means the state-owned enterprises are pushing in. Private enterprises are pushing in. And it's very much a top-down investment-driven thesis. And the benefits of that are obvious. China, for the past couple decades, has been the largest user of fossil fuels, right? So from a carbon footprint pollution perspective, it's a huge player there. And today, they're looking potentially to have declining carbon emissions very quickly within the next 5 to 10 years. And they're driving the global decline in fossil fuels. There are studies out there that say by 2030, the global fossil fuel print will start coming down because China is the global manufacturer for renewables and the costs are so low.
Right. And 10 years ago is a very different story in terms of getting China on board with some of these.
That's right.
These things.
That's right.
And so does that create opportunities in China, or does it just lower the costs for projects elsewhere?
That is less clear. The lowering costs for everybody is good from we're transitioning to cleaner sources and forms of energy. But it is less clear whether it's good or not for other countries from a manufacturing and industry development perspective. And so because China's costs are so low, it makes it really hard for other countries to then build up their own industries and their own companies in this space.
So China might be lowering the cost by making this more scaled, but in terms of as an investor, it sounds like there's not much opportunity to invest in China per se.
It is very difficult today. I would say the Chinese solar industry, the Chinese, even batteries over the last couple of years, they're losing money, right? In order to gain market share, they're losing money. So every additional unit they produce, it's going against their P&L. So
Wow.
That's an issue that China needs to solve for themselves, and they're working on it right now. It benefits everybody else who's using the technology, but it's not necessarily great for the investment universe in China.
Wow, that's really, really interesting. And what about the rest of the world? I mean, let's say a decade ago, you heard all this talk about Germany in particular and Europe kind of leading the charge here. What's going on in Europe as it relates to clean energy?
Europe has, as you mentioned earlier, been a lot more tuned into the lower carbon footprint narrative and the energy transition narrative than the U.S. historically. And they've continued doing that. I would say in the last few years, it's also been very important for them from a geopolitical perspective because Russia has historically been a large supplier of their basic energy needs, right? You have the natural gas pipelines coming in that supply a lot of their energy. And so they're trying to diversify for geopolitical and security reasons as well. And renewables has been a great way to do that. Now, every European country is a bit different. They do have a shared grid of sorts, so energy can be sold and bought across borders, but each country in Europe has their own way of advancing the energy transition. And so for investors, I think it's very important to understand the macro overlay as well as some of the micro of how exactly do you get projects permitted, what types of projects have the most support and can actually be built. And then after it's built, how do you asset management that over time? Because these are long-dated assets.
Given that backdrop, what sort of projects do you find attractive in today's environment?
Yeah, so just speaking specifically to the U.S., there are a couple areas that are quite intriguing today for us. So as we talked about earlier, we've had some market uncertainty due to macro policy uncertainty. And what's happened just in July and August is we've gained a lot more certainty on what that macro is. So now today we know more of what the rules and regulations are for governing steps forward in building out renewables. And the conclusion is, yep, we're still having to add renewables. It's still going to be the lowest cost. And the ones that you could actually build today, right? We say nukes, really intriguing, really interesting. That's 5-10 years down the line in terms of actually getting any scale. Even for natural gas plants, which is a competitive advantage of the U.S. because we have cheap natural gas. We're an exporter, so you might as well, consume it domestically. Even there, we're seeing bottlenecks in terms of the equipment necessary to actually build these plants. So yes, great, you could order a plant today, but that's not going to be up and running for at least 5 to 7 years because you can't get the equipment in time to get it done. And so from that perspective, renewables are the fastest ones that could be built and also the lowest cost still. And the One Big Beautiful Bill Act that came out actually provides a period of time where you still get all the tax benefits. Now, it's a fairly short period of time, especially for solar and wind, but you could get those tax benefits for the next, 4 or 5 years if you get the project up and running quickly. And so what we're seeing all of a sudden is this rush where, earlier this spring, everyone was saying, okay, we can't invest anything. We can't put money to work because we don't know what the rules are. Now we know what the rules are. And people are saying, all right, let's get this built, but we need the money for it. And that's where we see a lot of interesting opportunities for us to help and deploy capital and fund these projects so that they can be built and help add to our grid stability and all the power demand needs in the U.S.
And what kind of projects are these, just to get a sense of what they look like?
Yeah, so solar plants, storage. Storage actually has a much longer runway now, which is great also for that technology. And then wind farms that you have. There are newer technologies, too, that are starting to get incentives, and we're examining those as well to see, does it make sense for us to deploy?
What do you think is the biggest misperception about energy transition investing?
I think one of the ones in the U.S. is it tends to be politicized, and that's not necessarily reflective of the industry or even how the industry thinks about itself. So take, for instance, Texas, right? We think of Texas as very conservative politically, maybe, very oil and gas heavy, and it has been for a century plus. But it also has had the fastest growing renewable industry of any state.
Wow.
And it's starting to overtake California in certain areas, right? Because for the government, they're saying, we just want the cheapest form of energy. And the government actually helps you do that in ERCOT, where they will assume some of the costs of interconnecting that plant to the grid. And so, and they don't have as much permitting and studies and all of that. They make it really easy. And it's what's the cheapest form of energy? That's who will get built, and that's who wins. And all of a sudden, you see this huge increase in wind, solar, storage.
Wow, that is very interesting. I'd like to tap into a little bit of lessons learned. Have you seen things that have gone wrong in terms of investments in the energy transition? And what have you learned from that you think other investors could take away?
Yeah, so one of the things for us in private credit that is key is finding good partners. At the end of the day, we are lenders for the most part. We'd rather get paid our interest and principal, right, on the time that we're supposed to be paid. And we're relying on our operating partners to do their job and deliver. And so a lot of the underwrite is, let's make sure those that we work with are good partners. And I would say, one of the mistakes that we made was we thought we were partnering with a good partner, and that didn't end up being the case. Now, luckily, in private credit, there is a lot of control that we exert versus in the public markets in terms of how exactly we can assert our rights and what rights we have. And in this case, while we missed on the underwrite for our partner, we did get right our docs. So this goes back to the legal rights that we have. And as a result, while others in this, developer who were working with them did not make out so well through a bankruptcy process, we actually ended up getting paid principal plus accrued and sticking to our underwrite and achieving our underwrite case. Now, it was not a pleasant experience. I don't think any of us would want to go through it again, but at least there was some comfort, right, that we were still able to get there. But it's really key to pick the right partners in the space, because that's what will ensure, right, your investment actually can turn out the way you expect.
So it's not just about underwriting the asset that you're financing, it's about the partner. And when you say partners, you're speaking of developers, the folks that are actually building these projects.
That's right. And I guess another lessons learned for us is you always should leave a very healthy margin of error. because in the private space, oftentimes things will take longer and cost more. And as a result, really stress testing at the initial underwrite is very helpful. And take, for instance, we made some investments in solar plants around COVID time, and then COVID happened, and that disrupted the entire supply chain. And then rates went up. So we had higher interest rates. And if you think about what we are investing in, the underlying assets are very long dated. So an increase in interest rates over multiple, years really does depress the asset value. And then we ran into interconnection challenges with connecting to the grid and having delays there. And that's an industry-wide, right, challenge. But when you add all those things up, it meant that for that investment we made, we are not meeting our underwrite. We won't meet our underwrite. We're still going to make out okay. But these are the contingencies that you can't really plan for, but that they do happen. And so going in, I think we always remind ourselves, got to think about, what can happen? What's the worst case? How do you break even? How do you get made whole, at least on the principal? And really emphasizing that from day one.
This is a credit investment like any other credit investment. And so I imagine that your main source of returns come from an income stream. Is that correct?
That's right. That's right. So it's for us both that expected income stream as well as in a downside, we always run a liquidation analysis. So if things go wrong and you need to get out, how do you get out? And what is that market? And how do you manage it over time? Because worst case scenario, right, we're partnered with a developer. The developer, they say, you know what, I'm not making any money here. I'm going to hand you the keys. What do we do? And how do we make out with our principal plus interest, hopefully?
What do you do when they hand you the keys? How does that work?
Yeah, so for us, a lot of it is we partner with those that are in markets that we really like. So we understand the assets themselves. We understand the state or the power market that it's in and the regulations that's driving it. We understand who else are the market players. And for us, if a developer does walk away, for instance, on a solar portfolio or a storage portfolio, we have other partners that we could call on to help fill that gap. And because over the last decade, we have had experience owning assets ourselves and operating them ourselves, we know what can go wrong, and we really try to plan for that and figure out a path even before we make the investment to exit.
We covered policy, we covered global economics, we covered energy transition, private credit. Is there anything else that you wanted to talk about, that you felt compelled to talk about that we didn't touch on?
A program that I would say our team has benefited from and our firm has, called Girls Who Invest, where they take college sophomores who are in areas maybe not in finance or economics per se, but who have the rigors of that STEM education and that math background, and expose them to the investment industry. And so they get internships at banks and investment firms where they actually learn about what goes on, right? And for me, one of the great things about sort of my path is I felt like I've always had that opportunity. I was lucky. I got the information. So I knew about things. And as a result, I was able to kind of figure it out. But if I didn't get that exposure, I didn't know about it, then I wouldn't even know this sort of job exists. And what this program does is expose women early on enough where they still haven't quite picked their path yet to the finance industry, to investing, and say, look, this is something you can do if you want to do it, right? And so we've had success hiring interns from there. I think the program's grown quite a bit since their early days. And it's very exciting to just see that being so successful and seeing companies engage and really, fight for these interns. And my hope is that it continues expanding and there will be a time when it doesn't really matter, right? It's just based on interest, based on background, not based on, whether you're in the know or not.
Wow, thank you for sharing that. It's really wonderful to hear things going in that direction, particularly in our business, which can be a little bit difficult at times. Xiaoyu, that was an incredibly insightful conversation. I learned a lot. I'm sure our listeners learned a lot. And I hope you had as much fun as I did today.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for listening to today's episode. Please rate, review, and subscribe on your favorite podcast platform. I'm Brian Resnick, and you've been listening to Uncommon Capital.